Hello and welcome to another Blender tutorial from my side. Today we're going to look through some of the ways how to bake in Blender. That is normal maps, that is AO maps, and that is what I call texture transfer, where you can transfer textures from one object to another, basically. So the first one that we are actually going to do is the standard Blender baking with raycasts. So I have this tire here, this high poly, and I have this low poly here, just in comparison how they look. So you can see that it's slightly fitting this tire, maybe not 100%, but it's good enough. So the baking itself is now relatively easy. The only thing you have to be aware of is that baking only works if you select cycles. So from here on, select cycles. Make sure to go to GPU compute, and then you have the render sampling. So the higher the render count, the longer it takes to render, but the cleaner it is. I'm just going to leave it at 16 so we have a quick result. From this drop-down menu here, you want to now select normal, and usually selected to active will not be on, which is when you, for example, bake bevel normal. But since we have high poly, we want to bake from a selective to an active object. So we're going to open that up. And then you have these two values here. They're usually set to 1. So what they mean is, they're usually set to 0, not 1. What they mean is basically, it explains in the tooltip. So extrusion simply says it's a cage extrusion. So what it does is, it will copy this low poly and extrude it out by the value you give to make a cage. Usually that works quite well. Ray distance will say how far the rays that will shoot off this low poly here will move away from the object, where 0 is infinity, and if you set a limit to like 0.1 or 0.2 meters, that's how far the rays will travel. So in my instance, I know that for this object, 0.1 for both work just fine. And all we have to do now is go the select to active, which means that we select the high poly first, then we select the low poly, and we have to now make sure that we have a texture selected, which is this one. And when we did that, we can just press bake, and then we'll just wait. While this bakes, this way of baking objects is usually something that I would only do for simple objects and not some very complex objects, because there's some caveats that can occur. And we can see the normal mech just baked. So I'm just going to save this down, and then I am going to drop the normal into the normal map and select the non-color for the color space. And if we go to Eevee, maybe change the color slightly, you can see that it baked down quite nicely. There's some issues like these, but this is because I've set it to a 1K texture and only baking with 16 samples. If I bake it with more, it will be much cleaner. But because this is taking so long, I will just make a cut right here. And I'm now back with a more detailed normal map. This is also a 2K normal map, but this is fine for what you need usually. Alright, so on to the next normal map type. So this is the next way how we can actually bake stuff. So yeah, this is tire as well. And you can see that there's some objects that are not modeled into, but they're kind of like floating just above. And well, in this case they're not floating. As you can see here, they're part of the mesh, but they're usually called floaters because usually they would be somewhere around here, and well, it's just floating above the surface. But it serves the same purpose. So what you can do here now is there's also on this a bevel shader applied. If it would me just do this, and I see that I forgot this, so let me just plunk that in. So this goes normal map, and like this. So if I go into render mode, also I have to switch over to cycles. You can see that it is now part of the high poly map or high poly mesh, and that's what I want in this. So I want the full detail of the lettering and everything that's attached to the high poly mesh also be visible in the low poly mesh, and this is what we're going to do now. So we're going to do the same as we just did now. So we're going to set up our baking. So I want to bake. I'm in cycles already. I'm gonna select GPU. I want my bake type normal. Select to active, and then 0.1 and 0.1. You have to usually play around with these values slightly, because sometimes a bigger max ray distance will work, sometimes more extrusion, sometimes no extrusion. You have to really try this out to get a good result. Alright, so we select the high poly, select the low poly, make sure we have the image selected, and then we're just going to press bake. Alright, so the map is done. You can see it right here, and you can see that the detail I wanted is actually now baked into the normal map. So it took over the detail of the text and all the floating and hovering objects. Let me just save this down here. Throw it in, make sure it's a non-color map. And then if I remove this and maybe switch the color around it once again, you can see that it baked into the mesh quite nicely on this one. So this is how we use floating objects. Yeah, and Blender when baking a normal map. Okay, but what if you now have a much more complex object, or you're just not getting along with baking it with rays? Well, you can use a cage. So what a cage is basically in Blender itself, it's a mesh you can just select, but usually a cage is an instance or a duplicate of the low poly. Sometimes, depending on the program, it has to have the same UVs as the low poly. For example, in Substance Painter, that's the case. In some others, it doesn't really matter. So in Blender itself, I think it doesn't matter. I'm not 100% sure, but in any case, I usually take the unwrapped low poly anyway, so it has the same UVs. And what I'm going to do now is set up the baking. So we switch to cycles again, select the GPU compute, and we once again want to bake a selected to an active. And then you have this cage here. So what it does first of all is, if you select a cage, it will gray out the cage extrusion. So let's create a cage. What is a cage? It basically says the direction and the distance of the rays it can shoot from the low poly. In turn, or more or less, that also means that you have to enclose the whole meshes, so low and high poly, with the cage. The easiest way to do that in Blender is actually just, as I said, duplicate the low poly. And then what I like to do is give it a separate materials. Let's give it a cage material. Make this red, or any color you like, obviously. And then you go into edit mode. And then down here in the edit tab, you have the shrink fatten. And this is basically a pretty good way to create a cage. So you just click and hold, and now you can just basically fatten the mesh. And you can see that now either I go into one direction or the others, and that basically extrudes the whole mesh and every face into its own Z normal direction. So what I want to have is I want it fully in capturing both high and low poly, which it does right now. So that is my cage. If I now go back into my baking menu, I can select the cage right here, and you see that the cage extrusion is basically grayed out. So from now on, I once again only select high poly, and I select the low poly, select my image, and then I'll press bake, and we'll see what comes out of it. Nothing. Oh, maybe I shouldn't bake a combined map, but a normal map. I think that would help. So, you can see now it baked much quicker, and by now that in, so at the normal, see that it's here, and it worked as well. So this is how you use a cage. I would suggest using cages for very complex objects because in my opinion they work much better if you use the cages than the standard ray baking, but you have to try it out. I always suggest just trying out the ray baking first, so without a cage or the basically automatic cage if you want to say so. And if that doesn't work, you can always come back and do this. So one thing you have to have in mind here is, let's just use this and manually play with the cage. So manually like moving things around. So let's see how this looks now. If we bake this, because this will produce an error. So you can see that right here it created some errors. So let's see how this looks. And you can see that it didn't quite catch everything it needed to catch. So you can manually adjust the cage to your need and make it encapsulate the mesh but not stand out too far, because what happens if the cage is a lot bigger than your mesh, let me just show you quickly. So let's say you pump this up a lot, or maybe not just this, but let's do it like that. Oops. So let's do 20 degrees. So let's fatten these up. So something like this. You'll see that it will look kind of wrong, the normal map, so you have to pay attention that it's as close as possible on the mesh, but not too quick. Oh. And yeah, once again my blender is fooling me, so it's not updating this. So let's just quickly create a new texture and bake that again. Once again, just gonna quickly save these pictures from normal, and if I remove this now, you can see that actually on this it looks okayish, but you have to pay attention that it might look wrong in some cases where it will look stretched. I think this is fine because it's still looking kind of the same direction, but you can just play around, test it out, and you'll see it will look different, it will produce errors, so be aware of that. Alright, on to the next one. Alright, so this is something I've already shown, but I want to repeat it again because there's two things that you have to pay attention on this one. So this is just some object that I want to use the bevel shader on. So if I go into this view, you can see that it produces some nice rounding on the edges. And yeah, so there's one thing that I want to show you on this. So you can see that it's simply several objects into each other. So you can now do two things. You can either merge them all into one object, which helps in some cases, and I'm going to explain in a second why, or you can keep it that way. So keep them separated. There's something you have to be aware of though. If you scroll down here, you can see under output a margin. So what this says is for every object it bakes the normal map, it will put it on top of the other ones. So it will start, for example, at the top, bake this normal map, so just the UVs of this. So if I go into this mode, quickly show you, so we'll first bake this, then it will bake these, and this, and so on and so on. And it will only put them all on top of each other to create your final normal map, right? The number right next to it, so if I open the bake again, 16 pixels says it will, after every bake, put a padding of set pixels around the UV map. So for these, it will put 16 pixels in each direction of these UVs, and then for these, and for these, and so on. And here, some people might run into an issue because depending on how you pack your UV map, you might see overlapping normal maps. So when you pack your UV, be sure in the advanced options of the UV Pack Master to check your pixel margin. So let's say I will pack it for 4 pixels, which means that I have 8 pixels in total in between the UV islands. If I now bake it with a 16 pixel margin, I will have overlapping margins on top of my islands, so be aware of that. Because it says here, the margin in pixels the packed UV islands should have. This parameter is set to a value greater than 1, then usual margin options will be ignored, and the packer will determine the correct pixel margin. So what I do is I set it to 8, so I'll pack with 8 pixel margin, and this is my margin. And then here I will put in the same, so here we'll put in 8. But before we do that, I'm just going to put that to 32 pixels, so you can actually see what the fuck's happening. Have to make sure that I'm going to bake a 1024 map, and I'm just going to do that now. Quickly going to create a new map. So this is 32 pix margin, and I will just have this bake through, and you can see what's happening then. Just pay attention to this window on the bottom here. Oh yeah, once again, maybe I should select baking not a combined map, but a normal map. That would definitely help. I'm going to put down the render samples to 32 so it's a little bit quicker. Alright, it finished, and as you can see here quite well, there is a lot of overlapping stuff. So if I now simply save this image now, so just save it, normal map, front color. You can see that there is a lot of overlapping islands. So now I'm baking a new one, baking this with the correct 8 pixel margin. So 8 pixel, set my margin to 8 as well. And then I'll just bake it again. See how this looks. Alright, it's done. So packing this again. Selecting this as a non-color map. Dragging it in. And you can see that it's much better. What worked as intended. It's a bit low resolution, as you can see here, because it's just a 1024 map, and it's a little bit small for this object, but this is how you can bake several objects with different pixel margins. Now, if you simply join everything into a single object, this margin doesn't matter because it will bake every island at once and put in the full margin at once. So you can even put in, I don't know, 60 pixels, 64 pixels margin. It doesn't matter. It will just create the padding around the islands until it hits another padding of another island, and it will stop and it will look just fine. So this is why I wanted to show you the bevel normal this type once again. Alright, on to the next one. Alright, we are once again into a scene with a bevel shader, but this time I want to show you how you can actually bake floaters into a normal map of an object you want to bake a bevel shader with. It's quite, well, how to actually say it. It's works the same way as if you would use, let's say, a cage or the normal way, but you don't have to do high poly, which is the trick on this. So you see that I have my one object here. This is just my low poly, fully unwrapped as before. And then it has the material. And then this material, there's the bevel shader. In my other collection, I duplicated it. It's got the same material, so it has a bevel shader on this one as well. And it has some floaters, so I can actually show you now the proper floater. So you can see that this is floating above the surface, and floaters usually have this. Well, if there's some sort of like dimples or some extrusions or some insets, you can do them like this. So let's just quickly make another one to show you how this works. So I just want the plane right here, so I'm just going to make an inset. So inset right here. Going to make an extrusion a little bit smaller. Maybe not that small, so it's going to be a little bit smaller. And then I'm just going to add a bevel modifier, so I can control it. So something like that. Set it to smooth 2 times, and then I'm going to add a subdivision surface, and just going to scale it down slightly. And now I can put it on top of, well, a face. So let's say I want this here. Just going to bring this in as close as I can without intersecting. So this is a bit where you have to do some trial and error with like your baking setup and everything else. So I'm just going to scale this so it's a little bit something like this. You can see I have this inset right here. So don't worry about this edge you can see here. You will not be able to see it afterwards. Right, so now once again we'll do the selective to active baking. So I'm just going to select all my high polys and floaters. Then I'm going to select my final mesh. And once again, make sure that everything I set in is just fine. So I want to bake a normal map with selective to active. I don't have a cage, so I want to use the automatic cage. I have cycles on, I have GPU compute on, and let's just press bake and see what happens. You can see now it runs through the texture bake, but it doesn't create a map because it will only produce a map once it's fully baked. This is because it will just go through every floater until it's at the end, and then you will get a map basically. Alright, our normal map is just baked, and since I've just seen it, don't worry usually about these yellowish greenish areas. This only means that right on top of that same face is another face. So the normals, in this case the pixel normals, don't have any way to go. So it will look like a baking error, but it only means that there's some other face just right on top of it. Alright, so if I zoom out now, so let me just quickly save this file. Yeah, so you can see right here, this is where I wanted to bake it. See, it's in the normal map. Just gonna plonk that in here. Remove all of these, a little bit darker, and rotate my other direction. There we go. And you can see that it baked into the normal map quite nicely. So this is how you bake a bevel shader, which you can see that it's also added to the mesh itself. And some floaters. This is a really good way how to do extra objects or extra details if you really want them. Just be aware for farming sim, especially if you have very complex objects. I'd recommend baking these as an extra map and putting the maps on top of each other in Photoshop. This is my recommendation for this. If you have some simple objects like this AC, this works just fine. Alright, on to the next baking. Alright, enough normal maps. Now let's just go over to Ambient Occlusion, because this is also something that people usually want to bake, maybe in Blender. So there's a very quick way to bake a very simple Ambient Occlusion in Blender, and this is if you switch over the bake type to simply Ambient Occlusion. There's nothing else you have to do. Just select it, select the mesh. I will just merge all of them into once for a second. Select your AO test. Let's put this down to 32 so we have a quick map, and then just simply hit bake, and yeah, that's a very quick way how to get a normal map in Blender. There's not a lot of control in this, which is why there's also a different way how to bake yeah, an AO map. So you can see here I have the Ambient Occlusion node hooked into the color ramp node, and we will hook this up into the base color. So let's go over to this now. So you can see that there's not a lot of stuff happening right now. Even if I like change the distance, it's not really visible. So let's set the distance to 2. This is why you have the color ramp. So if you select the black node and slide it up, you can see that you get some out of it. So I'm just going to put it to 16. See if we get some nice AO. I mean, there's a bit of AO on it. Just gonna let this run through for a second. So to bake this now, instead of hooking this into base color, we will also hook this in emission, which will give us a completely bright result, which is what we want. So we don't want any sort of shadowing in this. We only want the pure color information for the ambient occlusion. And then the bake type, we'll simply select emit, which comes from emission. Select the same map again and simply press bake, and it will, yeah, produce the same map, but you have some more control over this. So if I slide this down once again, so I have barely any ambient occlusion, and just press bake again, produce another ambient occlusion map, which should look a lot brighter, as you can see here. Alright, so this is how you bake ambient occlusion in Blender. Oh yeah, I forgot to add. You can also add several different objects and bake normal and AO at the same time. You can just play around a bit and see what works and what doesn't. But this is a quick way to simply get a very quick AO out of it. And since I just talked about it, I mean, maybe I'll quickly just show you. So we're back into this tire with the floaters, and yeah, once again, just as we did before, high poly, low poly, and yeah, select the ambient occlusion from this to bake an ambient occlusion from a high poly to a low poly, and this will usually create a pretty good ambient occlusion, because there's not a lot you should be aware of, for example on a tire like this. So simply hit bake. It will just create a quite nice ambient occlusion map. It's a bit pixely in places because it doesn't understand the bevel shader. Actually, there's not even one on here, so let's add it as well. Alright, since I just talked about this, maybe I'll just quickly show you. So we're back once again into the scene with tire and the floaters. So the high poly tire. And well, all we have to do is once again select the high poly, then the low poly first. Make sure that we select the image, choose ambient occlusion, selective to active, set up our values, press bake, and then usually for a tire or something simple, this will create quite a good ambient occlusion. You have to be aware of one thing though. It doesn't fully understand the bevel shader, which is why you can see here it looks kind of iffy. So if you have something that in this case you want to bake at the same time as the normal map, understand that it will not produce nice results because it doesn't really have anything to put it on. It is there. Maybe it's better with a slightly bigger map because this is just a 1K map. So it is okay-ish, but if you want to bake something like this, you should do it in Substance Painter, where it bakes an ambient occlusion out of a normal map. And same here, once again, you can simply put an ambient occlusion into color ramp, also bake an emission, and this should also work on this. And it produces the same result, basically. So, yeah, that's it for this one. Actually, I just did a boo-boo. I showed you something that was wrong. So quick correction here. On the low poly, you can just remove these. You don't need these. This has to go on the high poly. So on the high poly, throw the ambient occlusion and color ramp into the emission. And for the low poly, you don't need anything, just the texture. And this is the final result. It's slightly better than what I had before. So as I said earlier, just try it out. This looks actually much better, I think, with a high resolution and more samples in the render sample number. You should get a quite good AO map. Alright, and last but not least, I want to show you how to transfer some textures from one object to another, if they're somewhat the same. So here you have we have this little tiny house. It's very crudely textured. The caveat with this one is, though, if we go into UV editing, you can see that it is textured with tileable textures. So every single face has its own material. So this is basically a multi-material object. So the roof has different material than the walls and then this. So you have plenty of different materials. This is not really performant if you want to bring it in a game, because usually they should have 1 to maybe 2 or 3, but I mean depending on the game, of course. But let's say you want to copy the textures of these, because this is quite a good looking building, to a target. So this is basically the same object, the very same object, and I want the textures from my source to my target. The first thing we have to do is go through every single material here and throw once again the color into the emission. So I'm just going to quickly do that. So emission, everything into emission. Emission is here. Nope, no texture transfer. I don't know why this is assigned on this. Oh, because it's part of a texture, but it doesn't matter. Just go through every single one. Window frame, there's nothing because the frame is just a solid color, so we will make the emission something grayish. And then on the next one, the window glass itself is something darker grayish, so something like this. Or maybe let's do something bluish. So somewhere around, let's say, this is some dark blue, somewhere around here. And last but not least, the wood. So wood goes into the wood. And this was metal, so let's go back into metal. Alright, so we just dragged every single texture into the emission slot. And now what we have to do is we do a high to low bake once again. So let's just set it up. So we're in cycles, we have compute, we have some render samples. We want a selective to active. We don't want a cage, but we want some slight extrusion. So we'll just try 0.05 because it shouldn't be too far off because I have some objects that I want to transfer and they have the same UV coordinates. And now we're just gonna press bake and see what we end up with. And it produced an ambient occlusion because I have ambient occlusion assigned. Yes, we obviously want the emit bake type. Alright, and here we go. It's produced, or it simply baked the textures, the only color information, onto my new UV map. So we'll just drag this in, and you can see that we have successfully transferred the textures onto this. Yes, it looks kind of funny because I deleted these out of the source, but that shouldn't matter. We just successfully transferred the textures from one to another object, and this is basically how to transfer objects. You can even have very simple objects. So this works for, let's say, if you want to add an LOD. So we can just quickly do this, make something really ugly. So I'll just drag this here. This goes here. So let's say I want to make a very good looking LOD of this house. So I'm just going to drag or create an object that's kind of look alike. Not quite, just kind of, once again. So we don't need this. Make it slightly smaller. Just so one quick unwrap. Zoom in, unwrap, and now I'm just going to deselect this, and once again I will just give this my texture transfer node. Looks kind of wrong, as you see here, and now I'm simply going to bake this once again. Might take a while to get the good results with the extrusions, so I'm just going to put in, let's say, 0.5 meter. Both. It should give me plenty of room to create a texture. So let's see how this looks. We bake a so let's drag it in, and you can see it produced something that's look-alike, and for an LOD this is all but fine. So yeah, if you want to do LODs, this is a good way how I recommend creating the textures for them so that they're somewhat similar. I think we can even try something. Let's just try a meter to see how it looks like. Might get something really funny looking. So let's see how this looks like. Yeah, I can see that. Then there's nothing here to compare it to, so we will get some weird issues where it doesn't know what to bake, so we just simply create some padding around. But yeah, this is how you transfer textures from one object to another object. And that concludes basically my quick tutorial on the different render modes in Blender. If you have any specific questions, or if you want to see another specific tutorial, please let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.